Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you everybody for coming. It's lovely to be here. So Iraq is clearly at a pivotal moment. The campaign to force Islamic State out of the country is in full swing, and it looks as though IS is on its way to being defeated. But what happens now, once IS is gone, is going to be absolutely critical to Iraq and its future. And I think the aftermath of the Mosul battle is not only going to throw up new challenges, it's actually going to bring to the fore a whole series of issues that the country has been grappling with for years. And I think it's important to remember, actually, that this battle against IS is being fought out against a backdrop of a political system that is completely stalled. I think we have the irony here. Iraq's fighting one of the biggest battles of its life, and it doesn't have a defence minister at the moment. It's also against the backdrop of the growth of powerful militia forces, continued sectarian strife, and an almost complete breakdown in relations between Baghdad and the Kurdish region in the north. And that region, of course, is also itself in dire political and economic straits. And again, there's also a broader economic crisis. Most importantly, however, I think the country's found itself locked in sectarian and ethnic politics that's almost brought Iraq to its knees over the last decade or more. So how Baghdad deals with its emergence from IS is going to be critical to the country and its future, and could make or break Iraq. And really, there are some key questions. Can Iraq overcome its sectarian politics? Will it be able to move beyond the personality politics that has dominated for years? Can the centre reconcile with the Kurdish region and other areas that might want to form regions themselves? And will the Prime Minister ever be able to implement real reform in the country and its institutions? Iraqis are certainly looking for change. Iraqis are fed up with more than a decade of violence, conflict, dysfunctional politics, corruption and poverty. And a report that came out from the Iraqi Planning Ministry in July 2016 put poverty levels now at 28%. So Iraqis are clearly hoping that what transpires after IS and Mosul will lead to a more secure future. So what I'd like to do today really is to look at what might transpire in Iraq after Mosul and focus on the challenges that Iraq needs to resolve if it's going to get back on its feet. Sorry, page. There we go. First of all, if we have a quick look at the situation vis-à-vis the Islamic State at the moment, it's clear from this map that IS has been pushed back considerably from when it made its mass expansion in 2014. As you can see, the red area is the area controlled by Baghdad, by Iraqi forces. The yellow area is the area controlled by the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. The grey areas are sort of sparsely populated territory, although IS does have a presence in some of these desert areas, and the black areas is where IS still has control. So far, the battle seems to be moving much quicker than many people had anticipated, and IS clearly doesn't have that much populated territory left inside Iraq. However, it's going to be a very tough fight to force IS out of Mosul itself, and the further Iraqi forces move into the centre of Mosul, the more they're going to be engaged in very difficult urban warfare. But I think we can say IS is definitely on the back foot. And I think what's notable about this battle so far is that Iraqi forces have come together for the first time in an unprecedented manner. They're actually working in a genuinely cooperative manner to try to get rid of IS. And indeed, the military appear to have been one step ahead of the politicians on this and far more willing to work collaboratively in this effort. We've seen the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Iraqi army working together. And so far, the Kurds are sticking to their agreement that they're not actually going to enter Mosul itself, but they're going to stay on the outskirts for fear of prompting a backlash. Most importantly, however, is that the Popular Mobilisation forces, the Shiite volunteer forces, have been pushed to the sidelines in this battle. And so far, they're fighting around the area of Tal Afar only. And like the Kurds, they're sticking to the agreement not to try to go into Mosul itself. And as a result, we're seeing this battle being carried out by the Iraqi army. And there's a key role being played by the anti-terrorism police, special police units, and this is a mixed national force, supported by local forces, and all this bodes well for this battle. So does this mean the end of ISIS in Iraq? I think it probably does. Losing Mosul is clearly going to mark a serious blow for IS. Mosul was always the symbolic heart of IS's self-styled caliphate. It was from where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi gave his famous sermon at the Grand Mosque in 2014, launching the caliphate. And it seems that IS is fragmenting from the inside. It's lost many of its core leadership. There are reports coming out of IS members trying to flee Mosul and being executed by IS because they're trying to run away. And the group seems to be in disarray. And the campaign against it in Raqqa and Syria is going to weaken it further. And I don't think we're going to see IS re-emerge, certainly not in its current form. I think we can say IS was the closest thing that Sunni militant Islam had to a mass movement. And this was mainly because it succeeded in tapping into Sunni grievances at a particular moment in time. IS was able to take advantage of the Sunni protests that had gripped the country during 2013 and 2014 against the al-Maliki government. And it was our former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, and it was his uncompromising way of dealing with these problems and these protests that turned so many Sunnis so decidedly against the government. And it was this disaffection that prompted locals to actually make space for IS to take over, because to many Sunnis it seemed like a better option than a Shiite-dominated government. And I think it's notable, one Mosul resident commented recently that when IS took over Mosul, they held a military parade. And he said, some people were celebrating during this parade and declaring their support for Daesh, or IS, but I don't think they really knew what was going on. I think they were driven by emotion and instinct rather than logic. And IS was also able to expand so rapidly because Baghdad had actually been turning a blind eye to what had been going on in places like Mosul and other governorates. In the year before IS took over, Mosul became what one resident called an IS playground at night. So the security services would withdraw, IS would move in and do whatever it was they wanted to do. But since that time, over the past couple of years, I think we can say that IS has become widely discredited. Its violence and brutality, which was what may have attracted some of its core ideologues to the cause, proved too much. And plus, it's proved utterly unable to rule effectively or to fulfill its promise to bring a better life to local residents, and its brand has been severely damaged. So I don't think IS is going to re-emerge as a movement that has popular support again. Now, of course, this doesn't mean IS is going to go away altogether. All the time the group has a presence in Syria, it's going to act as a destabilizing force for Iraq. It may try to regroup in other areas of Iraq, but I think it's going to be as a guerrilla insurgent-style force. So we're going to see more suicide attacks, more bombings, including in Baghdad, where it has sleeper cells. And wherever it can pop up to attack, it will. But it's never going to have that same momentum and power again. However, if Sunni grievances aren't addressed by Baghdad, then we may well see the emergence of new Sunni resistance forces. Perhaps the remnants of some of those groups that were absorbed into IS in 2014 that will continue to try to destabilise and carry out attacks. And we could even see a possible resurgence of al-Qaeda or forces loyal to it, who to some, compared to IS, looks like the clean face of the jihadist scene because it never engaged in mass killings for the sake of it in the way IS did. So I think Sunni militancy is going to continue to be a problem, but not as we've seen it over the last couple of years. Sorry, I'm struggling with this. That's it. So moving on to the sort of challenges once IS is actually defeated and pushed out of Mosul. I think one of the most pressing challenges for Iraq, of course, is going to be who's going to control Mosul and who will control Nineveh. And this is a hugely complex issue because, as many analysts have pointed out, Nineveh is like a microcosm of Iraq. The regional capital of Mosul itself is approximately 70% Sunni Arab, 25% Kurd, and the remaining 5% a mixture of Shiite, Turkoman, Yazidis, Christians, and other minorities. And there are so many different parties and constituencies all pushing to impose themselves on their ground and get their share of the pie. And the mistrust between these parties is great, and they have a history of a very fractious relationship dating back over many years. So who are the main players who are going to be looking for their share of the pie? Well, the Arab Sunnis, who make up the majority in Mosul itself, and they want things to go back to the way they were before IS took over insofar as they want to dominate. But they want a very different relationship with Baghdad. I think we should remember Mosul, which is Iraq's second city, has always been staunchly Arab nationalist. It's a conservative town, and it was also a key Ba'athist centre. And many members of Saddam's military and security forces were drawn from Mosul. And the Sunnis in Mosul feel that they were punished very heavily by Baghdad after 2003. Many members of the military and the security were pushed out of their jobs, they were mistreated, and a huge resentment built up in the city, hence IS's ability to take over with such ease. So the Arab Sunnis, who I should say are not united by any means, but in the main, they fear they're going to continue to be targeted and marginalised by Baghdad. So they want a solution for Mosul that will see them have a greater say over their own destiny. Arab Sunnis also fear Kurdish expansionism in Nineveh. And although they're on relatively good terms with the Kurds at the moment, they fear that the Kurds are after a greater role for themselves at the expense of Sunni Arabs. As for the Kurds, they also want to impose their own agenda. They've advanced into certain areas in Nineveh during this battle against IS, and they're not going to want to withdraw. And both the Arabs and Kurds also fear that Turkey is trying to get a bigger foothold through the Turkmen population in Iraq. The Turkmen fear they're going to be swallowed up by bigger players and want a bigger say, and the Turkmen Shiites, who have been empowered by their relationship with the Popular Mobilisation forces, are demanding their own governorate. And other minorities, such as the Yazidis and the Christians, distrust everybody else, and the Christians now are calling for their own governorate too. And then into this mix, of course, there are regional powers who are also trying to assert themselves, namely Turkey and Iran, who are competing for influence in Mosul and Nineveh. And the problem, as far as I can see it now, is that Baghdad seems to have no plan as to how they're going to deal with this, or how they're going to provide security there once IS is gone. And they seem to be relying on the fact that at the end of September, the Iraqi parliament passed a law stipulating that the boundaries of Nineveh should remain as they were prior to the IS advance, and that things should stay this way until local residents are able to decide for themselves, which is basically tantamount to deciding nothing. And meanwhile, there are growing calls inside Nineveh that the governorate should become a region in its own right, something that it can legally apply to do under the Iraqi constitution if certain conditions are met. This idea is supported by many of the Kurds, as well as increasingly by the Sunnis, who had always been staunchly against this idea, but who are moving closer to supporting it as they're seeing it as the only solution. Now, if this regional plan is pushed seriously, it has the potential to destabilise Iraq. If there's a region in Nineveh, then other regions will try to follow suit, such as Basra, that's already had a go at doing this before. And this could result in a major backlash and create real destabilisation. However, having said that, I think things might not get to that point. If the various local power brokers can come to some sort of compromise, then Iraq might be saved. And it's not inconceivable that they can come to a compromise. I think the Kurds know that they can't take things too far without there being a serious backlash. Arab Sunnis are so embroiled in their own squabbles at the moment, and they don't really have major military strength in the area. And Baghdad also knows that it has to make a success of this campaign and beyond. I think it's being viewed sort of internally and externally as a litmus test for Iraq. And the federal government is likely to try to keep the Popular Mobilisation forces out of the equation, and this is the most explosive element in this whole mix. So rather than full-on conflict, I think we're more likely to see an awful lot of jostling as the different components try to secure what they can for themselves and to ensure they're properly represented both in local government and the security sphere. Now, of course, this isn't going to be easy. It's going to be a long, drawn-out, complex process, but we're not necessarily going to see the all-out chaos that some are predicting. However, having said that, there are clearly lots of other challenges that Iraq needs to face up to if it's going to hold itself together. And it's essential that Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi capitalises on the boost he's going to receive for winning in Mosul to try to reset the political scene. And it's crucial that the political equation is rebalanced so that the Sunnis are brought into the political process in a meaningful way. Since 2003, Iraqi Sunnis, who make up around 30% of the population as opposed to the Shiites who make up around 60-65%, have felt themselves completely excluded and marginalised. And I think it's important to remember just what the Sunnis have experienced, especially since 2010, when under the leadership of Ayad Alawi, they actually won the parliamentary elections but were prevented from forming a government. And despite the power-sharing agreement that was drawn up after these elections, they ended up with no real power at all. And former Prime Minister al-Maliki made matters worse by clearing out key Sunni political figures, often by bringing arrest warrants, terrorism charges against them, and he also bought off other Sunni leaders, wooing them over to his side and thereby dividing the Sunni camp. and it ultimately excluded them from real power. And so the Sunnis found themselves going from being masters of Iraq under Saddam Hussein to having almost nothing. So al-Abadi needs to somehow tackle this. And he also needs to deal with other Sunni grievances that have been rumbling on for years. The Sunnis want changes to the anti-terrorism laws, to the de-Baathification laws that have seen thousands of Sunnis arrested and detained without charge. He needs to address Sunni demands for a national guard, a force with which they can police themselves. And it seems that Baghdad needs to overcome its fear of Sunni military power, and it has to somehow institutionalise these Sunni forces that are currently fighting IS into the official state. Al-Abadi is also going to need to rebuild the mainly Sunni towns and areas that have been destroyed by the fight with IS, and as well as deal with the displaced, most of whom are Sunni. And as I said before, this is also important because it was this Sunni disaffection that created an environment in which groups like IS could flourish. And so it's crucial that al-Abadi brings the Sunnis in, and this is clearly not going to be easy given the years of distrust and hostility. Another key issue that Baghdad is going to grapple with is how to contain the intra-Sunni violence that's also likely to erupt once IS is out of the way. And the fear actually now is that there's a real thirst for revenge among some Sunnis and Sunni tribes against other Sunnis who are perceived to have collaborated with IS and to have facilitated its taking over in 2014. We're already seeing sort of rather disturbing reports of tribes blaming others. There's reports from Amnesty International a few days ago about members of Sunni tribal militias going into villages and rounding up kids and young men and that they accuse of supporting IS and beating them and attacking them. We're also seeing lists being drawn up in some other areas that IS is being pushed out from, lists of those perceived to have collaborated. And there are real fears that Mosul's going to see an awful lot of this. I think we're also going to see a re-emergence for a battle of control between the different Sunni players and tribes in the Sunni governance. And again, we're already seeing competition as to who's going to take the leadership of the local councils in these areas where IS is being pushed out. And this is likely to continue. And I think the situation's made worse for the Sunnis at the moment because they have no real political leadership. The camp has fragmented so much that they've not been able to pull themselves under a united front. And how the federal government is going to contain all of this is not yet clear. And then looking over on the other side, the Popular Mobilisation forces and the Shiite camp. Baghdad is also going to have to deal with the Popular Mobilisation forces, these Shiite volunteer forces who've become so powerful over the past couple of years. And actually they're the real forces on the ground in many places. They still operate and have a lot of influence in many neighbourhoods in Baghdad. They're prominent in the south and in other areas such as Diyala. And we know the capacity that these forces have to create havoc, and we've seen reports of certain elements from these forces taking revenge against Sunnis in villages and areas where they've forced IS out. Now, some of these reports may be somewhat overplayed, certainly in the Arab media, but to many Arab and Kurdish Iraqis, the Popular Mobilisation forces represent nothing short of Iranian expansionism. And it's actually become a major psychological issue, I think, for Iraqi Sunnis in particular. Wherever they see the Popular Mobilisation forces, they see Iran. So al-Abadi has to find a way to rein these forces in. And it's really not clear what he's going to do with them once IS is gone and there's no purpose for them. And if the state can't find alternatives for who are mainly kids, many of whom joined up for financial reasons as much as ideology, there's clearly going to be a big problem on al-Abadi's hands. But what I think is actually quite interesting at the moment is that some of these Popular Mobilisation forces have actually determined now to enter the political arena. And a lot of them are putting themselves forward for the 2017 local elections and for the next parliamentary elections. And according to the Iraqi Higher Electoral Commission, they've already registered more than 40 political groupings of Shiite bodies that have fought against IS. And I think these forces are likely to have a strong showing both in the local elections and the parliamentary elections. They have an awful lot of popular support among many Shiite constituencies. They have religious legitimacy, because it was Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani who called for them to pull together in the first place. And they're regarded by many parts of the Shiite population as heroes, as opposed to the same old political faces who haven't delivered anything very much in the last 10 years, many of whom are absent for long stretches. I heard recently, I think about around 100 MPs out of the 328-seat parliament are regularly not there because they're living abroad and just not interested. So I think we could see a major recalibration taking place inside the Shiite camp. And this camp's been in disarray for much of the past couple of years. And these new popular mobilisation turned politician forces are likely to seriously dent the power of the main Shiite blocs and alliances. And they could well act as a further hindrance to the political process because the Shiite camp is going to be even more fragmented and there will be even more squabbling about who gets what and who's going to bring their own people into the ministries, into the administration. I think probably the only force capable of countering these popular mobilisation forces are the Sadrists, but Muqtada al-Sadr, their leader, is unpredictable. So I think the political arena could become less cohesive and possibly even less functional after the elections. Another major flashpoint for Iraq is the issue of the disputed territories, the territories that are contested between the Kurds and Baghdad. In particular will be the future status of Kirkuk, and I think this is probably far more explosive than what happens in Mosul and Nineveh. As we know, the Kurdish Peshmerga forces moved into Kirkuk in June 2014 to try to defend it, and they did defend it against IS. And since then, they've stayed put. They're running Kirkuk administratively and security-wise, and the Kurds have made it blatantly clear that they have absolutely no intention of leaving. Indeed, Kirkuk has always been one of the Kurds' most important causes, and they've always viewed it as rightfully theirs, something that's clearly angered the area's Arab, Sunni and Turkoman populations. So far, since 2014, this issue hasn't blown up, mainly because the Kurds did succeed in defending Kirkuk against IS, and because the war against IS has subsumed everything else. And also for many Sunni and Turkoman residents, the presence of the Kurdish Peshmerga, who have at least provided security, is preferable to the prospect of being taken over by the popular mobilisation forces. But once IS is defeated, this is likely to change, not least because Kirkuk is such a wealthy governorate and has oil. And we're already seeing signs of the tensions that might unfold. We've seen a lot of reports of Kurds driving Arabs out of their homes, preventing them from returning to the areas where they've been displaced from their own areas, something incidentally the Kurds have denied. But following the recent IS attack on Kirkuk, Amnesty International reported how hundreds of Sunni Arabs were rounded up and expelled from Kirkuk or put in camps, and their houses bulldozed because they were accused of facilitating the IS attack. There are reports too that the Kurds have been giving money to Arab families to leave the area. And all this appears to others as a deliberate strategy aimed at altering the ethnic composition of Kirkuk to make it Kurdish. The Kurds are also trying to consolidate their control over Kirkuk's oil sector and trying to link the oil industry there in Kirkuk to their own in the KRG. Now, this has been tainted somewhat by disputes between the different Kurdish parties about who has control of Kirkuk and who has control of the oil. But clearly, if the Kurds are able to annex Kirkuk, it makes independence seem all the more closer, something Baghdad is not going to countenance. So I think we're going to see a major issue over Kirkuk, and it's sort of a powder keg waiting to happen, and a lot of bad blood is going to be stirred up, especially if there's any attempt by the Kurds to formalise their control or to push for independence. I think we're unlikely to see full-blown conflict between the Arabs and Kurds. Both sides have probably got too much to lose to do that. But I think we're likely to see localised clashes, we're likely to see violence flare up, and it's going to be a long festering sore that's going to take years to sort out, and that's going to complicate relations between Baghdad and Erbil even further. Which moves me on to thinking about relations between Baghdad and Erbil. There's been a bit of a shift in this fractious relationship, I think, over the past couple of years. Once the Kurds were the kingmakers of Iraqi politics, and it was them who allowed al-Maliki to come to power in 2010. But actually, over the last couple of years, their influence in Baghdad has waned somewhat. And in fact, they've seemed almost absent from a lot of the political goings-on that have filled the political arena for the past year or so. And I think this is largely because of the internal splits inside the Kurdish camp and the differences between the main Kurdish political parties that have got worse and worse. And this has weakened the Kurds considerably. And notably, what we see now is that Baghdad has a much better relationship with the PUK and Goran than it does with the dominant party in the region, the KDP. And of course, the Kurds' position was weakened further by the recent expulsion of the Kurdish finance minister, Hoshyar Zebari, a few weeks ago. And he was one of the Kurds' sort of few poles of influence in the political scene in Baghdad. But what was interesting about this to me was that PUK and Goran MPs in the federal parliament voted to expel Zebari because he was from the KDP. And also the Kurds have been weakened and absolutely devastated by Baghdad's decision to withhold the region's share of its national budget as a punishment for their exporting oil independently of the central government. And the Kurdish region has been absolutely crippled by this move. And although it's continued to export oil independently of Baghdad against the wishes of the federal government, it's not been sufficient to sustain itself. And what we're finding now are many ordinary Kurds criticising Barzani for taking such an uncompromising stance towards Baghdad and getting the region into such dire straits. So while al-Abadi still needs the Kurds, they're not in as powerful a position as they once were. However, we have seen some signs of improvement in the relationship between Baghdad and Erbil over the past few weeks. This was through the Kurdish President Masoud Barzani visited al-Abadi in Baghdad at the end of September. These two figures began to reach out to each other, and they did come to an agreement over a new oil deal that will kickstart the budget payments to the Kurdish region. This is clearly good news, but I don't think we should overplay it. This is an alliance born out of opportunism and the desperation of both Barzani and al-Abadi, who are feeling increasingly isolated and wanting to shore up their own positions. And it's highly unlikely that the underlying issues between the region and the centre are going to be resolved in the near term at least. And this includes over Erbil's efforts to pursue an independent energy policy. Baghdad is not going to accept this, and the Kurds will continue to try to do everything to get out of the financial stranglehold that they feel Baghdad has over them. So while we may see somewhat of an improvement, we're not going to see an end to the fractious nature of the relationship. And then the other big question is, can Iraq reform itself? As I said at the beginning, the political process has all but stalled. It's been dysfunctional for the past few years, but of late it has got worse. We've seen the parliament divided, the government with a large number of ministers missing, and politics effectively paralysed. And I think one of the problems is that Iraqi politics has been so driven by personalities since 2003, and worse, the same personalities that have been there for all that time. And then, of course, there's the problem of endemic corruption. Transparency International ranked Iraq 161st out of 167 in its Corruption Perceptions Index, its latest one, which gave it the same rank as Libya. Now, al-Abadi has tried to reform the system over the past year. Notably, he's tried to move away from the quota system, whereby blocs are given posts according to their showing in the elections, and he's tried to do away with that and appoint a technocrat government. But despite his efforts, he's failed miserably, and this is because his hands are tied by bigger powers, namely forces within his own Shiite alliance who have restricted or rejected any change that will see a reduction in their power or influence. And I think we can say too, actually, al-Abadi has also shown a reticence to abandon his bloc and really push for change, and it seems he's still caught up in Shiite politics. So we're seeing a growing chasm between the political elite and the population. And as we saw over the summer, this was exploited by Muqtada al-Sadr, who called for widespread popular protests that brought the capital to a halt. Now, I think we're likely to see more of this kind of thing if things don't change. So it's clear that Iraq desperately needs to reform in order to move forward and create a system that can actually serve the country and its people. Whether he'll be able to do so is highly questionable. I mean, I think al-Abadi may be well-intentioned, but there are just too many vested interests that are more powerful and that will resist change. And I think all of this actually is falling on the shoulders of an individual, al-Abadi, who just isn't powerful enough. He isn't even the dominant voice in his own political party. He's always been a compromise figure. And his post has long been hanging by a thread. So while the battle against Islamic State might give him a boost, it's not going to be enough to enable him to enact real change. And if the scene in Baghdad is dysfunctional, the Kurdish political scene is perhaps even more so. And the past year has been especially bad. The region has no proper government, no parliament operating, and the main parties are at each other's throats. And the core of the problem has been the dominance of the region and the political arena by the KDP. The other two main parties, the PUK and Quran, have long been demanding a more equitable split in the way the region is run, and they keep complaining that the KDP controls all the key portfolios, security, natural resources, and it's calling for a shift too in the political system. And they want to move away from a presidential system that favours the KDP to a parliamentary system that will give them a greater say, something of course the KDP is rejecting. And all of these problems that have been rumbling away for many years came to the fore with the expiry of President Massoud Barzani's second presidential term in August 2015. And that situation still hasn't been resolved. So he's effectively still operating without a mandate. The KDP are determined he's going to stay, but the PUK and Quran are adamant he won't. And the PUK and Quran have come together and joined forces to block the KDP from continuing with business as usual. And as I said, we've seen the complete paralysis of the Kurdish political arena, and this especially after the KDP kicked Quran ministers and the Quran Speaker of the Parliament out of Erbil in October 2015. And I think it's really difficult to see how this situation is going to resolve itself, and the divisions have become so acute. At the moment, there's no real sign of any progress. In the past, the KDP was always able to smooth things over, but things seem to have got beyond that point. And things are so bad that there's talk now of the region splitting into two separate regions. And on top of this, the PUK itself is still in crisis, and it's struggling to contain the different currents that are inside it. It's still unable to agree on a leader to replace Jalal Talabani, who's been absent through ill health for several years. And there's endless backbiting and infighting that's being catapulted into the public domain. And I think all of this is creating a deep sense of unease in the Kurdish region. And we've seen repeated bouts of popular unrest. A lot of this is to do with the financial crisis, but there's also a feeling that their politicians are leading them nowhere. And there's anger too at the corruption, a sense that the money is coming in, but it's being eaten up by political parties. And all of this has an impact on the issue of Kurdish independence. I think Kurdish independence seems unlikely, certainly in the short term. I think the past year or two has shown the Kurds the difficulty of doing things alone. When oil prices are low, they just can't sustain themselves. There are also, as I've said, deep splits inside the Kurdish camp, which makes somewhat of a mockery of the idea of an independent Kurdistan. And plus, I think we should remember the KDP has always been far more into independence than the PUK or Quran. PUK and Quran would ultimately like to see an independent Kurdish state, but they've made very clear that they think the time isn't right now. In fact, this has really been Massoud Barzani's baby, and he would love to see it sorted before his presidency is finally out. But actually what we see is him raising the independence flag whenever he feels weak or whenever he needs to rally popular support in the Kurdish region. So at the moment, I think Kurdish independence is more rhetoric than reality. And the Kurds are actually going to focus their efforts on consolidating their territorial gains that have come as a result of the war against IS. However, that could shift depending on what happens in Mosul and whether or not there is a push to make Nineveh a region of its own right, or if the Kurds make a formal claim for the land they want to annex to the region, and if they feel empowered enough. And then, to complicate matters even more, Iraq is caught in the fault line of a wider sectarian conflict, and with neighbouring powers intervening right, left and centre. Turkey clearly has a keen interest in what's going on in Iraq, and we've seen all the latest spats between Ankara and Baghdad. I think Turkey's main concerns are driven by mainly a fear of increased Iranian influence being projected up into Nineveh, and they fear that Iran, backed by Russia, is trying to open a corridor through Tal Afar into Syria to supply the al-Assad regime. And Turkey, of course, is also afraid of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is Turkish, that has actually gained some real traction in Iraq as a result of the war against IS. And we've seen it was PKK fighters who actually pushed IS out of Sinjar, and it now has a growing presence and support there among Iraqis, among Kurds and Yazidis, and the PUK that it is linked to. And there's talk too that the PKK is linking itself to some of the Popular Mobilisation forces, and all of this, of course, alarms Turkey. And for Turkey, there's also the fear of an empowered Kurdish population more generally in the region because of what's happening in Syria too, and fears of a Kurdish state. I don't think we're going to see Turkey going as far as to actually making an incursion into Iraqi territory in this Mosul battle, which is what it's It's been demanding that it take part, not least because the US is putting huge pressure on Turkey at the moment. But I think we can also say that Turkey is unpredictable and it's not beyond the realm of possibility, and this would create a real crisis and a backlash with the Popular Mobilisation forces. And then there's Iran, that's keen to uphold and extend its influence in Iraq, which concern is to ensure that the government remains Shiite dominated and that Iraq stays within its sphere of influence. And I think we have to remember as well that Iran doesn't just have close ties to the government in Baghdad and to some of the Popular Mobilisation forces, but it also has close links to some of the Kurdish parties, the PUK and Goran. And for Iran, Iraq is also important as a place through which to supply the al-Assad regime in Syria. The Gulf is also interested in what's happening in Iraq, particularly Saudi Arabia. I think it's been interesting, Saudi Arabia never really engaged with the government in Baghdad after 2003. And its concern has always been to protect Sunni groups and factions, and that it will continue to do because it also fears Iranian expansionism. So all of these powers are likely to continue to try to push for their interests via their proxies in Iraq, and all of this, of course, stirs up an awful lot of mistrust and bad feeling and complicates the situation further. So it's clear that the post-IS environment in Iraq is going to be a mess, or very messy, and that Iraq is facing a mammoth task. And I think it's actually unlikely to resolve these complex, thorny issues. They're just too difficult and they're too deep-seated. And still it seems there isn't enough of a will to go beyond sectarian or ethnic politics. However, Iraqis are fed up with conflict. They want some security and stability, and I think perhaps the most likely scenario will be that Iraq will regain some stability after IS has been defeated, but obviously it's going to be very fragile. But actually what's likely is that it will half solve some of these more pressing issues, and actually it will continue to limp along with short-term plastering over the cracks. And of course, that might allow for investment opportunities. The defeat of IS clearly opens up investment opportunities across a range of sectors, including oil, infrastructure, housing, agriculture, healthcare, services, pretty much everything. We should remember Iraq has a young and growing population, 33 million, a burgeoning consumer market and underdeveloped infrastructure. However, Iraq still suffers from significant structural and governance deficits, corruption, a weak legislative framework, and also, I would say, a rentier state mentality. But I'm going to leave Ahmed to cover in more depth some of the economic issues. So really, I would just conclude by saying clearly the Mosul battle marks a turning point for Iraq, but there are enormous obstacles to overcome. And in the face of all of this, can Iraq hold itself together as a unified state? Well, I think it can for the time being. I think there's still a strong attachment among many Iraqis to the idea of being a unified country. There's a strong nationalistic component, a strong nationalistic feeling among many components, and there's no appetite for a divided Iraq within the region either. Having said that, one cannot deny that there is growing talk and growing support for a federal solution. The Kurds are pushing for it, the Sunnis are increasingly pushing for it, and the Sunnis, who have traditionally been the most nationalistic of all. However, there are also still many Sunnis who remain staunchly opposed to such a solution. The South might also be open to a federal solution, but this is mainly to do with financial concerns more than ideological issues. It just believes it should get more of the oil wealth from the oil that it produces in its own region. But I think, so there is a push for federalism, but this is still very much the realm of the minority rather than the masses. And the Shiites will certainly reject it, and the Sadrists will reject it out of hand. So while these calls might grow, there's going to be fierce resistance to it. But I think the bottom line is that while Iraq might be able to drag itself through this crisis, through this next phase and defeating IS, actually if the country is going to get back on its feet again and function as a unified state, it not only needs to engage in resolving all of these problems, what's important is that it also needs to embark on some sort of national reconciliation process to bring all these competing forces together and actually get them to start working for the national good as opposed to their own interests. And to me, this still seems like a very long way off. So Iraq, I think, still has a long, long way to go. Thank you.
Very good morning to you all. And I think as an Iraqi, the first time I see an Iraqi expert who is truly an Iraqi expert, I think this is one of the most difficult thing is Iraq is a very, very complex country. And I think Alison has did a very, very fair description of what Iraq is like and so forth. So mercifully, my part is shorter and more maybe, I don't know, more solvable thing. Now, Alison basically gave an idea of how the Iraq structure was. I think quite important to see where the economy is. It's quite important for me to take you back just up to 2014 to see what kind of a country Iraq was economically. It's the lower part. Okay. So basically, I'm here just to chart Iraq in numbers. Now, as you all know, Iraq is an oil-producing country, but very much like all the Gulf, Iraq depends on oil to a huge extent. Oil generates up to 90 to 95% of government revenues. And the government is very much like all the governments in the region, whereby it's more like a rentier state. So basically, it is the largest employer in the land. It employs over 50% of the population, of the working population, whether in the government or state-owned enterprises. The other part is that the government pretty much controls all the non-oil economy. So every kind of work that happens in Iraq is one or other driven by government. Now, louder. Okay, so pretty much everything is driven by the government. And the non-oil sector is driven by government contract and government business, and that even extends to the banking system. The banking system is pretty much controlled by 2 or 3 state banks, which pretty much control between 90 to 85% of both deposits and loans in the country. Now, one of the things that Alison described was the political paralysis under the Maliki regime. One of the issues that really hurt the country a great deal was that there was no real infrastructure built. Iraq was completely devastated by 35 years of conflict. I mean, running all the way from the Iran-Iraq conflict to the sanctions over the 1990 onwards and then civil war. So the whole infrastructure is completely destroyed. Now, nothing was built during that time, no infrastructure, and particularly one of the things that's been a rallying cry for many Iraqis is the lack of energy. There is no power generation. Iraq has estimates of needs of something like 16, 17 megawatts per year, but its capacity is more like 8,000 at best. Now, that's one of the things. So that gives you a sense of where the economy was just prior to the IS invasion or ISIS invasion. Now, at the time, a third of the country was lost. So with Mosul gone, what you had was a massive diversion of resources, basically manpower. All the Popular PMU units, they didn't come out of nowhere. They're mostly working people. They weren't really so much the non-productive government employees. They were like the average worker. There was diversion of that. Then there was the financial cost of the diversion and of the war. And finally, you had the displacement of 10% of the population. So really, it pretty much crippled the country. Now, on top of that, you had the collapse in oil prices. So as a result, the only way the government could cope with the twin challenges of war as well as lower oil prices was they underspent. They underspent significantly on everything. They did it in 2 ways. One, by cutting salaries, delaying salaries by a month, 2 months, 3 months. That's pretty much ongoing for the whole thing, and cutting people some sort of forced savings. As a result, what happened is consumer confidence almost completely collapsed. But that's one part. The other part is the government underspent on investments. The budget, it has something like 2/3 of the budget is current spending and the other third is capital spending. They completely stopped that. As a result, they didn't pay contractors, they didn't pay businesses and so forth. And these businesses and contractors were the only functioning companies in Iraq for most of the part. As a result, they were the ones who had most outstanding loans. So what happened is the banks were hit with rising NPLs, and the overall result was the economy really came to a complete standstill in the sense of the liquidity crisis was significant in a sense. Most banks were not able to meet deposits, so there was, the average consumer had their money at the banks, but they cannot withdraw it. And many banks in Iraq are on the verge of bankruptcy. So you had that. That's where Iraq is. So right now, the thing is just the stability that comes from Iraq, just the stability that comes from the end of conflict and slightly stable oil prices and international aid, that has the potential of reversing a huge deal of that. And that's where part of the opportunity in Iraq is the rate of change from almost huge deficit into a slight positive. Now, the only thing that worked in Iraq's favor during that time was oil production. Basically in 2015, 2016, production and exports for the first thing were up 10-16%, and on top of it, 2016, they were up 21-24%. But that doesn't even touch it, because the 21-24% will most likely be 30%, almost 40%. The country had a phenomenal success in raising production and exports. That's in spite of significant obstacles that the country has. So that's where it is right now. Now I am an equities person, and I look at markets to tell me where the direction of the world goes. And the charts I gave to you are sort of my three favorite sort of correlations in Iraq. The first in red is the oil price. The green is the Iraq Stock Exchange Index as measured by one of the brokerage houses in Iraq. And green and the gold is Iraq's loan outstanding bond. Iraq, soon after 2003 and 2006, issued a $2.7 billion Eurobond that is due in 2028 and has a coupon of 5.7%. Now that trades internationally, and it pretty much gives you a sense of where international investors look at Iraq. And obviously, as you can imagine, with the crash in oil prices and the IS conflict, the hope was given up on Iraq. The bond saw a pretty remarkable recovery from the all-time lows in January, where the bond and oil prices hit very much lows near 20th of Jan. It's up something like 30% by now, with the oil prices up something like 80%. The equity market obviously took a lot longer to move because it's a local market, so it has its own issues, what have you. But to me, I look at that as basically a return of confidence in Iraq in the sense of the wider picture. People are betting that the country is not going bankrupt, that it can pay its debts. And by the way, that recovery in the bond market is taking place at the same time that there is talk that Iraq might be issuing more bonds. So I think I take it as a positive sign on that. But if you look at the real economy, what is taking place is that some companies have begun to visit Iraq from the beginning of the year, once it was clear that the whole IS conflict was coming to an end, if not 2016, 2017. And most companies with long-term horizons have started coming. Two interesting examples, very different, but they sort of really give you a sense of what it is. The first is, for instance, GE signed a contract of $1 billion in the beginning of the year for electricity generation. It's the first real contract they had since 2008. The other one is a sector you would never expect in Iraq, and that's tourism. The Wyndham Group of hotels is building 2 hotels in the holy city of Najaf. Now, most people think, why would people look at that? And the interesting thing is, for those who don't know, I think everybody is familiar with the millions who go to Hajj in Mecca. Now, Mecca is known that you have 2 million annual pilgrims during the Hajj. What people don't realize is that this number in Iraq is significantly higher. An event that takes place pretty much around the end of this month. It's called the Arba'een, which marks the anniversary of the death of Imam Hussein. That sees something like, the figures are there. I find hard to believe. Every time I read them, I can't believe them. But the figure is, they see visitors of 22 million people during this 40-day visit, of which 3 million are from Iran. Now, if you imagine the number of tourism there, it's incredible. Religious tourism, but that gives you an idea of what people are planning long-term for Iraq. And for this, you need stability. You don't really need a functioning Iraq as I don't imagine it will ever be fully functioning, but a stable and limping along is more likely. Now, the other thing is the IFC, the International Financial Corporation. The IFC has been one of the longest-term investors in Iraq. They've been in Iraq since 2007. They've had various portfolios. They invest in projects, plus also in companies and in buying equity stakes in certain companies. Now, in April, they signed a phenomenal deal in the sense of, one, because of its size, $375 million financing for an energy production in the Kurdish region as well as in Baghdad. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the IFC's one of its aims is that it wants to bring in foreign capital into Iraq, or to de-risk the process. And that financing was $250 million from the IFC and $125 million from Lebanon's Audi Bank. That gives you a sense of how some international banks are coming back to Iraq. The last time something of this size happened, and it had foreign participation, was in 2007, when the IFC arranged a syndicated loan for Zain Telecom, which is one of the largest telecom companies in the region, a Kuwaiti company, but owned an Iraqi company. That was for $400 million, and it had participation of European institutions, mostly aid agencies or development agencies for Iraq. So that gives you a sense of the vote of confidence that people are looking for Iraq. In the sense, part of my own thesis on Iraq is that the only way to heal the divisions or to stem the crisis we have in the region is to invest in the country, because the country can afford to pay for the investment, but also that it's one way of fostering stability, of removing this threat of extremism, and I think it's happening. Finally, the other part of aid that is coming in the picture is the aid from the IMF. Now, the IMF signed a standby agreement of $5.4 billion in around June. Now that is an aid for the budget to plug in the budget shortfalls and so forth, but Iraq believes it could unleash something like $15 billion more in aid. But you're looking at various institutions whereby they're working on an immediate stabilization fund for Iraq and extended stabilization of fund for Iraq, plus other various bodies that have expressed interest or a desire to do that, like the Islamic World Bank is talking about a $3 billion loan. The World Bank is saying something about $20 billion spending in the region between now and 2021, but it is coming. Now, markets and opportunities are mostly about rates of change more than the actual pure numbers themselves. So what this figure would, in a way, contrast with a sharp different figure that we've seen in 2015, a report issued by Moody's. And the findings are incredible. It said that FDIs was down by 30% in 2015, down to something like $3.2 billion. Portfolio inflows were down by 80% to $630 million. All other kinds of direct investments were almost, the exit doubled, something like $8.6 billion. So you have a massive drain of either FDIs or investments or aid, contrasted with a huge, well, small, but a beginning change on the positive. And that's, I think, what drives the opportunity, and for us, someone like me, what drives the opportunity for the Iraqi market. And finally, is what opportunities are there in Iraq. Alison pretty much went over the details. The reconstruction of liberated areas is the highest priority, and where the largest opportunity is. That would take place in Nineveh and Mosul and all the areas, Ramadi and others. These areas are not only important for what they are, but they have the other important, they are the trade routes. Iraq's largest trading partners are Iran, Turkey, and the Arab world. And for Turkey, it comes through the north. So going through that road, that development is very important. The Ramadi area is the trade that goes through Jordan and elsewhere. Now, all of that in the region has stopped in the last 3 or 4 years, ever since Syria and then Iraq. Now, a lot of that would come back because the trade in the region is a phenomenal business that's put on hold. So a lot of that would come back. So that's one part. The other part is the traditional infrastructure spend. So basically oil and gas. You divide that into 2 regions. You've got the KRG, which has smaller fields, but the logistic challenges. The KRG is a mountainous area. It's landlocked. So there's an enormous infrastructure to be done just to be able to use that and transport oil and so forth. The KRG has huge potential for gas. It actually can be, they say 2020, I don't believe it because the KRG always talks a good story, but I think it's more likely to be 2025. The KRG can supply a substantial portion of Turkish gas, i.e. lessen Turkey's dependence on Russia. Now that would have enormous demand and investments. Then you have power generation. That's, as I mentioned, is a shortfall. Iran, by the way, is one of the biggest players in Iraq in generating power. Recently, they signed a $2.5 billion deal to supply a pipeline that basically supplies gas, of all things, to Iraq to power stations, and Iraq would agree to buy from them for the next 15 to 17 years. Plus, Iran views it as a way to extend its influence. So a lot of its electricity generation spending is in mostly Shia areas. And finally is in consumption. Iraq is a young population. It's a population that had went through, I'm one of the few lucky ones who pretty much lived all my life outside. Those who lived in, they've been through 35 years of all kinds of conflict. And there is a huge demand for consumer spending. One of the things people don't realize about Iraq has a young and thriving digital electronic marketplace, i.e. places like, similar to Amazon and similar to delivery and so forth. So that there is that. Plus, the potential for Iraq has many companies that have pretty much used to be state champions but been dormant over a number of years, and that's mostly simple electronic companies, bicycle companies, basic chemical companies, basic pharmaceuticals and so forth. These companies need a large number of investors to kickstart, because they've had significant competition over the years from cheap imports, but no ability to compete and to spend on their infrastructure. And I think on that I'd end my 5 minutes. Thank you.